Hey, everybody, it's Tommy Canale, and welcome back to Before the Lights podcast, the show that tells you how they made their mark. He's a photographer. He was a songwriter, arranger, a guitarist. He was with the Beatles on their last tour in 1966. He has worked with the likes of Cher, Carly Simon, and Don McLean as a record producer. He's a member of the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers, a Massachusetts native that now resides in California. Please welcome to the show, Ed Freeman. Ed, welcome to Before the Lights.
Hey, how you doing, Tommy?
I am well. I'm excited to have you on the show. Where did your music influence come from?
Wow, that's a really tough question. A lot of different places. I grew up in a family with a musical father who was a classical pianist and also tinkered around with jazz. I listened to a lot of folk music when I was growing up. It was sort of the beginning of the folk era. When I was in college, I became heavily immersed in Motown, the sort of beginning of Motown. I also got into 16th century English lute music. And that was a big influence for me. And I started playing folk guitar, but influenced by my lute playing. And then somewhere along the line, I got interested in just 18th century classical music and composition and orchestral composing. And it's sort of a big mixed bag.
It definitely is. You attended Oberlin College and majored in French and Russian.
Yes.
Was there a plan for this before getting into music?
There was no plan at all. I never once, in the 4 years I was in college, I don't think I ever once thought, well, what do you really want to do when you get out of college? I assumed, because of my family background, everybody in my family went on to be a college professor. So I assumed that that's what I was going to do because I didn't know anything else. I dropped out in the middle of my senior year, and that was the end of my education. And so I had to make a living doing something. So I figured I'd teach guitar because I played guitar, and that's how it started.
You were a folk singer in Boston. You've worked with Buffy St. Marie. You've traveled with Phil Oakes. Did you perform at the Newport Folf Festival as well?
No, I did not. My connection with Buffy St. Marie was only that I photographed her, and she recorded one of my songs. My connection with Phil Oakes was that I was his road manager, his advanced man for a few months. But I did not perform at the Newport Folf Festival. By that time, I had sort of given up performing entirely. Did
you ever attend the festival?
Oh, yeah, I did. I think a couple of times. And it was an eye-opening experience for me. I saw Dylan the first time he went electric. I saw the Chambers Brothers where a whole white audience learned to clap on the 2 and the 4 instead of the 1 and the 3. That was a moving experience for me. Yeah, it was great.
Did you see Pete Seeger?
You know, I've seen Pete Seeger a number of times, but I can't remember if I ever saw him at the Folk Festival.
Man, I mean, I have a couple vinyls of the Newport Folk Festival, and, you know, just listening to it brings you back into a different time period that this world will never see again.
You know, there's an old expression that if you can remember the 60s, you didn't live through them. Let me just say that I did live through the 60s in no uncertain terms. So.
Fair enough. You were with the Beatles on their last tour in 1966, managing the Remains. How did you get this gig to travel with the Beatles?
First of all, I want to say that I was probably the most unqualified person on that tour. I had no business being on that tour. I was friends with Barry Tashian, who is the and with the remains in general. I just we were friends in Boston, and they didn't have a road manager. And when it came time to tour with the Beatles, they asked me because, you know, I was able-bodied, I was reasonably intelligent. I'd never set up a drum kit before in my life. I knew I'd never touched an electric guitar. I was a folkie after all. I had no qualifications other than the fact that I was friends with Barry and the guys.
Were you a Beatles fan?
By that time I was, yes. I was a huge fan. I went from completely ignoring them to when I heard Rubber Soul for the first time, I was just thunderstruck. As a matter of fact, I listened to the first side of Rubber Soul, I think probably 8 hours a day for 2 weeks before I even turned it over and listened to the second side. I was dumbstruck by I thought it was the most amazing innovation in music that I had ever heard. So
Rubber Soul has made many people become a Beatles fan.
Yeah, it's one of the most historically important pieces of music ever made.
Ed, being on that tour, how crazy was the pandemonium?
I don't know how the words to describe it. It was utterly crazy. And the technology that's available now for tours, in terms of security, in terms of sound reinforcement, in terms of being able to hear what you're doing on stage, all of that was not there. We had scenes like, I think it was in Cleveland or someplace like that, where 5,000 people rushed the stage because they couldn't hear a damn thing. The performers on the stage couldn't hear themselves because they didn't have monitors on the stage, and they certainly didn't have earphones and mix like they do now. So it was crazy. The whole thing was just crazy, you know, and then there were enough drugs to go around to make it even crazier. So, yeah.
Hence, if you could live through the 60s. Did you have any idea that was going to be their last tour?
No, I didn't. As a matter of fact, something which I've kicked myself for ever since is the last day at San Francisco, Candlestick Park. I was packing up the gear, and there were only 3 roadies on the tour for, what was it, 4 or 5 groups. So we all did each other's handiwork. And I was packing up the Beatles drum kit, and I had the whole thing packed up and put in the van, and I saw the drumhead, which said "The Beatles" on it. You know, it was lying on the table on the floor of the stage, and I thought, "Oh my God, I don't want to unpack the whole damn kit and put this damn drumhead back in there. Maybe I should just take it as a souvenir." Oh, but no, I can't do that because, you know, they'll need it for their next tour, and it must cost at least $10 to have this thing painted. So I unpacked the whole drum kit and put the drum head back in the kit. They never performed again, except for on the roof of the Apple building. That if I had kept that drum kit, I could have probably, you know, paid for somebody's college education with it.
Easily. I can see. Was there any other regrets from the tour?
Well, let me say, if you can remember the Beatles tour, you didn't live through it. That's another. It was a big blur, you know, and I have to say that, you know, I get all these questions like, what are the Beatles really like? You know, I was handling equipment. I was not like sitting around chumming with the Beatles, although I did that to some extent, but mostly with just George, and I didn't have much contact with the rest of them at all.
Speaking of chumming, though, you did fly on the same plane with them, but I understand that they just didn't want to be bothered, or you just couldn't go back and talk to them. Is that correct?
No, they invited us. They sent Mal Evans out to they were in the back of the plane, and they sent Mal Evans out to tell us that they'd be happy to have us come back and visit. Mm. But mostly we were so intent on being cool, that we didn't do that. And I didn't feel it was my place because I was merely a roadie. I was a road manager. I wasn't one of the performers. Barry Tashin did develop a relationship with George Harrison, and they did spend some time together. And as a result of that, I spent some time with George too, just by being his sort of plus one. But generally, we were all sitting around being very cool. It's also why I didn't take a lot of pictures. I was a photographer at the time, interested in photography, but I didn't take a lot of pictures of the tour because I didn't want to come off as a tourist. And besides, that film cost $1.75 a roll, and that was a lot of money.
Right. I was reading up on some of your background, and I found something interesting. You had mentioned that you had this strange kind of unspoken connection with George Harrison. What is that connection?
Well, when you're on stage, you can't see anything, and mostly you can't hear anything except noise. And it's a very disconcerting experience. The audience is not lit up. You've got all sorts of lights in your face, and you can't see anything. And so I would stand at the front of the stage, just literally with my hand on the stage. It was maybe 5 feet tall. And I would just look up at the group. And in the course of doing this, George and I sort of locked eyes. And this happened every time they performed. And we would just stare at each other for the entire set. And that I was sort of, a human connection for him. But we never mentioned it when they weren't on stage. It happened every performance, I think, except maybe the first, that we would just stare at each other, and it would give him some kind of a human contact to make a connection with. And the strange thing is that about 4 or 5 years later, I was taking an elevator in New York in some music industry building, and George was in the elevator. I got in the elevator, and we looked at each other, and we locked eyes exactly the same way we did on stage. And we went up 10, 15 floors, whatever it was, staring at each other. And then I got off the elevator, and we never mentioned it. And it just, that was the way it was.
Is the tour with the Beatles, then, is it justified to say that's what jump-started your career?
It certainly made a difference, because when I was in Boston, I was a big fish in a small pool. And when I toured with the Beatles, I saw what a big pool was and how small a fish I was. And when I got back to Boston, I said, that's it, I'm moving to New York. And I packed up my stuff and moved to New York. And I remember as the plane was sort of circling to land at LaGuardia, I remember looking down at the city and saying, I'm going to make it in the city. And I did.
The determination and probably the experience from the tour helped as well.
Yeah, it was I had, an incredible experience that very few people have, and I certainly didn't have any qualifications for it, but I got a sense of what the big time was. And right after that, I got a job stage managing a show that I think the Who were at in New York, some theater in New York. And then I got a job working with Phil Oakes. And then, so I sort of had a sense of how the business works. That's what the Beatles started me off. And, in Boston, I was a folk singer making $15 a night playing in small clubs. And It's not really a reasonable intro to the music business, but the Beatles were.
From New York, you eventually moved to California in 1977. You put your own band together called Joyful Noise. You get signed by Capitol Record. You record 2 songs for a 45, and the band breaks up. This might be the best contract I've ever seen in doing research for all my guests.
You certainly have done your research. I think you're the only person on earth that knows that. We broke up. We had actually gotten our contract with Capitol Records and I think a $5,000 advance, which was a lot of money in those days, based on one song that I sang the producer. A guy named Nick Venet, who had produced the Beach Boys and Linda Ronstadt and Lou Rawls, Sam Cooke. I mean, he was a very qualified producer. And I sang him one song that I had written, and he said, "That's it. You're the next Bob Dylan." Signed the band, and we moved into a house in Topanga Canyon. Bought enough dope to keep us going for a year, and proceeded to break up.
I wonder if that 45 is still floating around somewhere, the Joyful Noise.
It was never released.
Oh, okay.
I have the only copy.
So then, Ed, how did you end up becoming a music producer?
Another thing, totally I recorded these 2 songs for Capitol, for this producer, and he decided that I was a wash-up as a performer and wasn't particularly interested in my songwriting, but he was interested in my arranging. So at that time, I don't know how long this story goes on, but I had written a string quartet to accompany one of the songs we wrote, or that I wrote. And I was sitting in his office one day after we broke up, and he sort of mentioned casually that he was looking for an arranger for this song with another group, Hedge and Donna, that he was recording. And I said, "Oh, I'm an arranger." No, I knew absolutely nothing about what I was talking about, but I needed the money. And so he said, "Oh, really? What have you done?" I said, "Oh, I've written, symphonies, string quartets, chamber music, opera." I mean, just lied through my teeth. I hadn't written anything except this one string arrangement for the record that we made. And he said, "Oh, great. Here's a tape. I need a string quartet and 2 Bach trumpets tomorrow at 7 p.m. And so I said, "Yeah, no problem." I walked out of his office very casually. And when I got out of sight, I ran down Hollywood Boulevard to the nearest bookstore, bought a book on arranging, read it that afternoon, wrote the arrangement that evening, came back in the next night with the arrangement written. It was, I've never heard it ever since, so I don't know how good it was. It was good enough so that I went back to New York with him and became his arranger. Wow. And wrote a bunch of things. That I think I wrote 2 things, and then he said, "We're doing a 60-piece symphony orchestra next week. Write it." And I bought another book on arranging because I didn't even know what half the instruments were. But I wrote something for 60-piece orchestra, and I conducted it, and, wow, came out okay. So then at one point, we sort of had a falling out, and I ran into Tom Rush at a party, and he said he was looking for a producer. And I said, "Oh, I'm a producer," and I had never produced anything. But he somehow believed me, and that's how I started.
You just got to lie through your teeth, read books, and it'll all work out in the end.
That's it. That's my advice to the world. Right? Shoot first and ask questions later,
That's right. You're producing it eventually evolves. American Pie with Don McLean. You were part of this. How did this iconic song get recorded?
Well, Don came to me because he had heard a record that I had produced with Tim Hardin, which was prophetic because Tim Hardin was a notoriously difficult person to work with. And I developed a technique where I would just splice together, sections of like one word would be 3 different takes, spliced together. And, there wasn't one song on that record it didn't have at least 50 splices in it. And this seemed to work, this technique, and it got applied to Don as well. Not because Don couldn't perform. Don was and is a superb performer. He could go through an entire evening without needing a retake or a splice job, but he tended to want to improvise. And I wanted him to sing the song the way it was supposed to be sung. I had a very clear idea about how it was supposed to be sung. So I just let him record it any way he wanted with all the improvisations he wanted. And then I spliced out all the improvisations and put it together as the way I thought it was supposed to be.
It's a timeless song that changed music, basically.
Yeah. Yeah. I've had this thought. I've never really expressed it, but Don is a extraordinarily capable and talented songwriter. But he never, before or after, wrote any song anywhere even remotely like American Pie. So I had the feeling that this song came out of some alien visitation or something. I don't know what. But he wrote a bunch of beautiful love songs and sort of heartfelt things like Vincent. But American Pie, which is this 8.5-minute long metaphor for the decline and fall of the American Empire, is unlike anything else he ever wrote. And I just, I think he must have been possessed in some wonderful way by some external intelligence to have written this. It's not to give him any less credit than he gets. I mean, he gets 100% credit. I didn't change one note in that song. I arranged it and I edited out all his improvisations and I produced it, but I did not change one note or one word in that song. It's exactly the way he wrote it. And it's an extraordinary piece of writing. I was blown away by it when I heard it, and all the time we were working at it. And we worked on it for 3 months and never failed to amaze me.
When it was done, did you know you had a timeless song on your hand?
I knew that we had a classic. I never crossed my mind that it would be a hit record. Mm. As a matter of fact, I famously said to his manager when it was finished, I said, well, that's all very well and good for an album, but what are we going to do for a single? And he said, oh, we're going to release American Pie. And I said, you got to be kidding. Nobody's going to listen to that. And then we had to try to put an 8.5-minute song on a 45. And the nature of 45 records is that you can put 2.5, maybe 3 minutes tops on a 45 before the sound quality just completely degenerates. And we had to put an 8.5 minutes on 2 sides of a 45, and it was a joke. It was horrible. Radio stations ended up playing the LP, the 33.
To get the whole 8.5 minutes in.
Yeah, exactly.
Outside of what we've already talked about, you have done film scoring, computer music, consulting, teaching. You have built recording studios and become a full-time photographer around the age of 50. Is this what makes you the happiest?
Actually, I've moved on. I'm still doing photography, of course, but my latest fascination is with ceramics. I've been just completely taken over by the notion of Well, first of all, I've been throwing pots on a potter's wheel, and I'm loving it. And I'm getting into ceramic sculpture. And even the past few, just very recently, I've been working with an AI program, a visual program, and creating sculptural ideas in AI. And I'm just enthralled with the possibilities that are out there. I don't know how to do it yet. I'm still very much my eyes are bigger than my stomach, put it that way. I have this great idea of what to do, but I don't quite know how to do it yet. But I'm working on it. And I'm loving it. I'm having the greatest life you can imagine. I'm just having a great time.
So ceramics now is what's making you the happiest.
Yeah, right. And this may turn into steel sculpture, or I don't know. I designed something yesterday that I thought, wait a minute, this would look fantastic as a 15-foot tall sculpture outside of some big office building. I mean, this is it. This is it. I'm doing it. And I just got so excited by it. I thought I have to find out how to do it. But, that's just technical information. You can find that out.
I got a question for you back into photography for a minute. What is the relationship with photography and musicians? Because it seems like there's a big percentage of them that are. I've had a couple other musicians on my show, Timothy Drury, who was a keyboardist with Don Henley, and Kevin Baldus is with the band Lit, and they're both heavy into photography.
Yeah, it's a very common double. As a matter of fact, it's so common that when I meet another photographer, I say, "Oh, you're a photographer? What do you play?" I don't know why that is, except that it may be that there's a mathematical element in both of them. There's an intuitive mathematical element. It's not like I sit around, when I'm writing something for orchestra, I'm sitting there thinking, wait a minute, what's the math? What's the equation? But music has a fundamentally mathematical basis to it. And so does photography, although you never even think about it. But I don't know why this is. I've met, there's got to be hundreds of actors who are also painters. Why does painting and acting go together? I don't know, but it does, because this is very, very common double.
Yes.
Photography and music are the same. I remember once when I switched to photography, and I admittedly was, shall we say, rather liberated in my mind at the time. But I remember looking down for a split second. I looked down at my hands and I thought, oh, I'm holding a camera. This must be photography. Because the thing is, photography goes in the hole in the front of your face, music goes in the hole in the side of your face. They both meet in the middle. It's the same thing. It's just photography and music, they feel the same inside. They come out different, but they feel the same inside.
You started taking pictures around the age of 12 and then became known for your underwater nude photography. How does underwater nude photography become a thing?
Well, put it this way. How would you like to spend a day floating around in a warm pool with a bunch of gorgeous naked people?
I'm signing up.
How much is that suffering?
You're not.
Come on, that's a lot of fun.
I mean, were you there right place, right time? I mean, how did this all evolve?
I was sitting in I've shot a lot of nudes for the same reason, I mean, come on, nudes, how much better can that get?
Right.
But I was sitting in a cafe once and I was thinking, what am I going to, how can I do, where else can I photograph naked people? And I looked over at somebody who was sitting next to me and we struck up a conversation. And it turns out that he was a model. He was the captain of his swim team at the University of Hawaii, and he owned a pool. And I thought, how much, I always ask the universe to speak loudly. I'm deaf. I thought, how much more obvious can this be? Obviously I meant to photograph this person underwater. And I did. And then he brought in a bunch of his friends, and I photographed his friends. And then I got to be like 20 people at the same time. And I thought, well, great.
Are you a good swimmer then?
I can't swim. No, at all. I mean, I really can't. So I would wear like a 20-pound weight belt to keep me down and just hold my breath and go down. And then half the time I would have to get rescued by one of my models because I couldn't get back up. And I certainly couldn't swim any distance. I mean, I could sort of dog paddle, on a good day. But no, I can't swim. So there was a little extra added excitement in that, was I going to drown in the process of doing this?
Listeners, if you go to edfreeman.com, you can see the work that he has done with photography and some of these underwater nudes. The portraits are beautiful, and you can even buy some of his limited prints that he has for sale on the website. Go to the show notes. I'm going to put a link to edfreeman.com. What's the difference for you that I've read you don't want to do headshots, or you did them for a while and never did want to do them again? What was it about headshots that you were just like, it's not for me?
Well, I'm interested in portraiture. I've always been interested in portraiture, but headshots are sort of anti-portraiture. They're the point of a headshot is to make you look like you could do almost anything. That you could, wait a minute, I could act this role or that role or some other role. I could be the guy next door, or I could be a mass murderer, or I could be a doctor, or I could be an undertaker, whatever. So the idea of a headshot is to make you look as generic as possible. And the idea of a portrait is to make you look as individual as possible. And I shot over 1,000 headshots, and it destroyed my feeling for portraiture. It's a horrible form of a horrible way to photograph people. And it's taken me years to get past that. So headshots are, ugh, I hate them.
I know you're now into ceramics, and we're probably going to see this new, who knows where it will evolve from where you're going next, but into photography, you're still doing a little bit or whatever, how much time you're using. Is there still one shot or one shoot that you still dream about doing or getting?
Whatever is next. I always think my next picture is going to be the best, and my next pot that I throw is going to be the best, and the next sculpture I make is going to be the best. And when I'm finished with all this, by the way, I have a string quartet in me that I'm going to write someday when I get some free time that is going to change the world. But to the extent that string quartets can change the world. But I'm still, my best work, I hope, is still ahead of me.
Absolutely is. I've always said if your best work is already done, then you're doing nothing but decline.
Right, exactly. No, I want to go out in a burst of flames.
That is right. Your architectural series, Desert Reality and Urban Reality, has been the subject of touring museum shows. Listeners, you can see them as well on his website. The Desert Reality series, I looked at that and just kind of went back over and over and over. There's some beautiful portraits in that Desert Reality series.
Okay. Well, the first thing I'm going to do is you fell for the pun. That's all I can say, because the pun is the name of the series. If you look at the spelling, it's not reality, it's realty.
Realty.
Desert Realty, because it's portraits of buildings. But I hope everybody misreads it as Desert Reality, because it's not real. These pictures are not real. That's the joke. These are portraits of buildings that have been massively retouched. And so they look like they're all isolated in the middle of the desert where there's nothing else. There's nothing but sand and mountains in the distance. And most of them look like that. And the fact is they might have been on an urban street,
Wow.
but I cut out all the buildings on the side and placed them in a desert environment or a country, wilderness environment.
Nobody would know that if you didn't tell them.
Well, the thing is, you look at these pictures, and I think what most people's reaction is that real? That looks almost like a painting, but it's a photograph. It's sort of, you can't quite tell.
Right.
And that's exactly what I wanted. I wanted it to look like maybe sort of test your credibility. Is that because it is photographed, but it's not real. So it's right on the borderline.
When did you start getting into ceramics and pottery? When did this start?
About 3 years ago. It's all I can tell anybody is that if you ever do this, if you ever put your hands on a lump of clay and put it on a potter's wheel and turn it into a pot, your goose is cooked. This is the most addictive thing you can imagine. And I've seen this happen to hundreds of people. Just, they throw one pot and they go, oh my God, wait a minute, let me do one more. Just one more. I know how I can quit. I can quit anytime. And then, years later, they're still doing it. So, yeah, it's a wonderful, meditative, physically just addictive experience. Yeah.
When did it start? When did you do the first pot that got you hooked?
It was 3 years ago. I was walking by this, there's a pottery studio, sort of a community pottery studio about a block and a half away from where I live. And I was walking, I kept on walking by it, and looking in, thinking, what is that? What are they doing there? They make pottery. No, it doesn't interest me. But then I asked him one day, do you let other people in there or what? He said, oh yeah, you can take a lesson. And so I took a lesson, 1 3-hour lesson. And that was it.
That was it.
Just hooked. Yeah.
Well, I hope that we start seeing this new website of Ed Freeman pottery coming out and people will start looking going, I want that pot. I want that. I want this.
Yeah. That, the day when I start selling it, well, that'll be in career number 18 or something. I don't know.
Your life, Ed, is it kind of like right place, right time with a mixture of luck?
I wish I had some wonderful advice. First of all, blind luck. Yes. Be born under the right star. I guess that's the first piece of advice I would have. But it never occurs to me that I can't do something. It just doesn't, I thought, oh, I can write something for orchestra. Why not? I'll just read this book on how to write for orchestra. And I did. Mm-hmm. And, I could produce records. Why not? Or I could take pictures. Why not? And I think a lot of people get hung up in, but I don't know. And I don't know how to do that. And I wouldn't know where to start. And that just never bothered me. And I don't think it should bother anybody. I think you should just get in there and do it. And, you'll figure it out as you go along. And what's the worst that can happen? Doesn't work. So what?
Correct.
Pick yourself up and go do something else, or do it again. Do it and fail 50 times until you do it right.
I agree with you. When you look back at everything you've done in your life, is there one particular thing that always comes to mind first of everything that you've done?
I don't do a whole lot of looking back, to tell you the truth. I'm really, right now, I'm just completely obsessed with looking forward because it's all done. I can't do anything about everything that's done. I've made thousands of mistakes. So what? Big deal. It's all done. Can't do anything about it. What I'm really interested in right now is looking forward. And to me, that is ceramics, photography, and AI. And I hope I'm here long enough. I'm 80 years old now, but I hope that I'm here long enough to really see these things come to fruition, or the ideas that I have, mature enough to see the light of day. That's what I'm fascinated with.
You've brought something up that I've brought to the stage many times. I'm also an inspirational speaker that speaks about me overcoming the odds of battling and beating cancer. And I say it's inspiring you to inspire others. And if you're not careful, your time will run out, so you need to flip your hourglass. But you brought up something that really stood out for me, and that's this. There's a reason why the windshield in our vehicles are twice the size as the window in the back of our cars, because what's ahead of us is twice as bright than what's already been behind us.
Yes. And what's behind you is behind you,
It's in the rear view mirror.
Yeah. And if you let it sort of drag on your coattails, well, I don't know if it's doing you a whole lot of good. I mean, maybe you can take what you've learned of value and bring it into the present and go forward with it. But to bring all your doubts and failures and misgivings and all that, and recriminations and all that into, no, what good is that doing you? Forward, onward.
I am with you. Ed, thanks so much for taking time and coming on my show and talk to me about a kind of an encapsulation of your life. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, Tommy. It's really been a pleasure.
You have been more than welcome. And listeners, if you want to get connected with me on inspirational speaking, go to TommyKinally.com. I'll put a link to that in the show notes as well. That's going to do it for this episode of Before the Lights. I'm Tommy Kinally. And until next time, everybody, I salute a chin chin.